I never wanted to believe my own blood could betray me. For years, I held on to this stubborn faith that if I gave enough love, if I tried hard enough, my father would finally see me, truly see me for who I was. But that moment of awakening never came. Instead, I discovered the ultimate deception, hidden behind legal documents and forged under the pretense of family obligation. A trust fund for my sister, only my sister, while I stood there, left to carry both my father's burdens and my own. That discovery unleashed a storm inside me, a fury so raw it sparked my darkest, yet most liberating, sense of vengeance. I grew up in a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood most people only saw through police reports and cautionary tales on the nightly news. My father, a gruff, distant man named Harold, was the landlord of my early life, dictating rules instead of offering warmth. My mother had died when I was young, and though I was too small to remember her voice, I clung to the scraps of stories told by neighbors and old family friends who occasionally passed by. Whenever they spoke of her, they inevitably painted a portrait of kindness, of a woman who had the power to warm an entire room with a single smile. Without her, the house felt constantly cold. You'd think the absence of a mother might bind a father and his daughters together. Instead, it forged an unbridgeable gulf. My father favored my younger sister, Nadia, to an extent that everyone found bewildering. Nadia was 4 years younger than me and had that easy confidence that comes from knowing you're doted on, indulged, and always in the spotlight. Even in her toddler years, she seemed aware she could do no wrong in his eyes. I remember her shrill cries for candy, or new shoes, or special lunches, and how my father rushed to fulfill every whim. Meanwhile, in my corner of that musty apartment, I tried my best to stay out of trouble. I did chores not because anyone asked me, but because I thought it might earn me a crumb of praise or attention. Washing dishes, vacuuming the carpet, folding laundry, they were all small tasks I hoped would make me visible. But it never did. My father would walk right past, carrying a shiny present for Nadia, or a new coloring book, or the promise of ice cream. Yet even at a young age, I sensed a quiet strength growing in me. If nobody else was going to ensure I felt cared for, then I would learn to do it for myself. I used to dream about a better life, perhaps going to college, seeing the world, or simply living where I could hang pictures on the walls without peeling paint flaking off. Those small, distant hopes kept me going whenever Nadia's shouts of triumph resounded through the apartment halls. No matter how many times my father compared us, claiming I was difficult while she was so easy to love, I tried to keep my chin up. At 8 years old, maybe I didn't fully comprehend what was happening, but I understood enough to know I was the outsider in my own family. At night, when the cracks in our walls let in cold drafts, I'd pull an extra blanket over me, close my eyes, and imagine my mother was alive, hugging me close and whispering that I wasn't alone. Perhaps I clung to a ghost, but that ghost was kinder to me than any living soul in that house. As the years crawled on, I watched my father bestow favor after favor on Nadia. He'd enroll her in dance lessons, buy her lavish outfits for recitals, and brag about her talent to anyone who'd listen, even though half the time she showed no real interest in dancing. She liked the applause and the way all eyes turned on her, more so than the art itself. Meanwhile, if I so much as needed shoes for school, my father would bark at me to go earn the money myself. So I did snatching up babysitting jobs, helping neighbors with groceries, anything to scrape together a few dollars. By the time I hit my teenage years, an invisible line had been drawn in that apartment. Nadia on one side, me on the other. My father tolerated me only so far as I stayed quiet and out of the way. But though it hurt, it also ignited a sort of determination inside my chest. I vowed that I would never, ever bow to such injustice once I had the means to stand on my own. Perhaps it was naive teenage bravado, but it was that fire that kept me going as I navigated homework, part-time jobs, and the daily tension under my father's roof. And so, in those early years, I learned to be my own rock. I believed that if I worked hard enough, I could free myself from dependence on his twisted sense of favoritism. If there was any spark of hope that my father would come around, it was overshadowed by my unwavering desire to prove that I didn't need him either. It was a lonely path, but it also shaped me into someone who could endure adversity. I didn't yet realize how much more I would have to endure, or that one day I would discover his biggest betrayal and harness the fury to turn the tables on him and Nadia. But the seeds of both heartbreak and resilience were planted in those childhood shadows. It was my junior year of high school when I first caught a glimpse of what the real world could offer me, and also what it could demand. I had won a partial scholarship to attend a summer pre-college program at a local university. It felt like a dream, a chance to explore a campus library, talk with professors, and sit in an auditorium that smelled of worn leather seats and intellectual possibility. I was ecstatic this was my ticket out of our cramped life. Unfortunately, that opportunity came with a steep cost to me. Although I'd gotten a partial scholarship, the rest of the tuition and materials required more money than I could comfortably manage through my babysitting and side hustles. I summoned the courage to ask my father for help. I prepared a speech, carefully lined up my arguments about how this could be a gateway to better things for me, and maybe even for the family. He listened with his back half turned, rummaging through a drawer for God knows what, and then gave me a dismissive grunt. He said, "I don't have that kind of money to throw around. If you really want it, find a way to pay for it yourself." I was 16, still half a child, but I swallowed the hurt and decided I'd do whatever it took. I doubled my workload taking a job at a local diner, washing dishes until my knuckles were red and raw, staying up until past midnight to finish my homework. Somehow, I scraped together just enough to attend the summer program. I'd show up to those lectures, exhausted from a full shift, but my mind was on fire with possibility. For the first time, I tasted a future that wasn't overshadowed by my father's neglect. If there was any silver lining to his refusal, it was that it proved I didn't need him. My success would be entirely my own. Ironically, my father always had money when it concerned Nadia. When she decided she wanted to try figure skating, he paid for months of rink time and coaching. When her school trip to Europe came up, he covered the cost with hardly a second thought. Standing on the edges of her spotlight, watching him lavish her with funds while telling me he was broke felt like a slap in the face. But I learned to nurse that bitterness into motivation. If I wanted to continue my education, I'd have to do it on my own, and so I did. By the time I graduated high school, I'd pieced together scholarships, federal aid, and a mountain of student loans to secure a spot at a state university. The day I moved into my dorm, a part of me felt free for the first time in my life. No more living under my father's roof, no more daily reminders that I was secondary in his eyes. It was a small victory, but also a huge weight off my shoulders. College wasn't easy. The scholarships and loans only covered so much, and I had to work nearly full-time as a waitress at a chain restaurant near campus. My routine involved early morning lectures, afternoon study groups, then evening and sometimes graveyard shifts. It was grueling, but in the blur of exhaustion, there was a sense of triumph. I was doing it without my father's help, something my teenage self had promised would happen. Nadia, meanwhile, coasted by at home. She'd breezed through high school with minimal effort, and by the time I was a sophomore in college, she had decided on a whim that she wanted to pursue a career in interior design. Without hesitation, my father bankrolled an expensive private program for her. He even bragged to the neighbors about his princess and how talented she was. Despite the resentment that threatened to consume me, I tried to focus on my own goals. I majored in business administration, hoping to someday start my own venture and break every tie with my father's meager sense of control. I poured every ounce of energy into becoming someone who could stand tall without needing to beg for anyone's help, especially his. If that also meant earning enough to one day overshadow everything he had ever given Nadia, then maybe that was a guilty pleasure I allowed myself to dream about. Every holiday break, I returned home to that same musty apartment that never seemed to age, though the tension grew thicker each time. My father would barely acknowledge me, reserving all his affection for Nadia. Still, I pitched in with rent when I could, paid for groceries when my father claimed he was short. A twisted part of me hoped, even after all these years, that he would finally see the lengths I went to for the family. But each time my contributions went unmentioned. He rarely looked me in the eye, too busy fussing over Nadia's needs or bragging about her latest achievements. Like clockwork, I'd pack my suitcase, promise myself I'd never set foot in that apartment again, then break that promise months later out of some residual sense of duty. Those years blurred into a collage of late-night studying, heartbreak, occasional triumphs, and a simmering anger that became my constant companion. If I had known what awaited me down the road, that years of sacrifice and unrequited loyalty were nothing but an afterthought to him, perhaps I would have cut ties earlier. But in those days, I still believed in the power of family, in the notion that he was simply misguided, that maybe Nadia's hold on him was just a phase. I couldn't have been more wrong. By the time I turned 23, I had a bachelor's degree in business administration clenched in my weary hands. It had taken me 5 long years of part-time semesters and brutal work schedules to get there. But the moment I walked across that stage in my cheap black gown, I felt something akin to euphoria. I wasn't just graduating college. I was stepping out of the shadows, leaving behind a life of scrounging and begging for the basics. My father was conspicuously absent from the ceremony, but I hadn't expected him to come. Nadia sent a single text message that read, "Congrats, I guess," which I tried my best to ignore. With my degree and a fierce hunger to prove myself, I landed a job at a small startup. The pay wasn't glorious, but it was steady, and it gave me the opportunity to learn every facet of running a business from the ground up. I threw myself into my work, arriving early, staying late, always looking for ways to improve our operations. My boss, a no-nonsense entrepreneur, quickly took notice of my diligence and grit. Over the next 2 years, I climbed the ladder from an administrative assistant to a management position. The pay jumps weren't massive, but I learned the invaluable skill of self-sufficiency, and with that came a confidence I had never felt before. During that time, I managed to put away some savings, finally upgrade to a decent apartment, and start paying down my student loans. There were nights I'd lie awake on my new, comfortable bed, absent the smell of mold or the roar of sirens outside, and wonder if this was happiness. It wasn't perfect, but it was leagues beyond the life I'd known, and I took pride in having crafted it entirely by myself. Occasionally, though, guilt crept in. My father had started calling me once a month, always to ask for some financial favor. Perhaps he needed help with the bills or the heating had gone out. Each time I hesitated. I told myself that he'd never done the same for me, that Nadia was the one who'd received everything from him, so why should I give him anything? But then I'd remember those small, fleeting moments of paternal care. He wasn't all bad, maybe just a product of his own upbringing. So I would relent and send a check or wire money. I wasn't wealthy, but I had enough to spare a bit, and part of me still yearned for his acceptance. Foolish, maybe, but old habits die hard. And then there was Nadia. She lived in an airy loft downtown, paid for by my father apparently. She was finding herself jumping from one interest to another, never holding a real job for more than a few months. Sometimes she'd call and talk me into meeting her for coffee mostly, so she could brag about how my father had purchased her a new car or was helping her take a trip to Italy. I'd sit across from her in some trendy cafe, listening to her airy laughter and feigned woes over what color scheme to choose for her living room, all while I struggled to hold back the taste of bile in my throat. When I'd ask if she was working, she'd wave her hand dismissively. "Daddy says I shouldn't stress too much, you know. Live life a little. Besides, there's always the trust fund." She said those words offhandedly, as though she were referring to a normal inheritance every child expected. I remember feeling a strange pang when I heard it, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just one more example of father's favoritism. I didn't dare ask the details. I didn't want to know how deeply the knife was buried. It wasn't until my father's health scare, a few months later, that I found out. He'd had a minor stroke, though the doctors said it was largely due to stress and high blood pressure. The moment I heard, I rushed to the hospital in a panic. Despite everything, he was still my father. Nadia was there, but strangely aloof. She didn't seem as concerned about his condition, focusing instead on whether the hospital parking was covered by Daddy's insurance. In that stark, white hospital hallway, with the smell of antiseptic stinging my nose, I overheard a conversation between Nadia and one of the doctors. She casually mentioned that once the old man passed on, she'd have her trust fund to keep her comfortable. The nonchalance with which she said it made my stomach churn. She turned to me and said, "You do know about the fund, right? Daddy set it up in my name years ago. Some fancy lawyer wrote it up." She laughed. "It's basically my golden ticket." Blood rushed in my ears. The question that rose in me, thick and suffocating, was, what about me? But the wave of fury at the hospital was eclipsed by worry for my father's recovery. So I forced a smile, pretended it didn't matter, and focused on making sure he was stable. But that night, when the hospital lights dimmed, and I stared at his pale, motionless figure hooked up to monitors, something inside me cracked open. All these years, I had stretched myself thin to support him, and he had legally ensured that his money, however much or little it might be, would go solely to my sister. A creeping suspicion told me that there was more to the story, that the reason he always claimed to be broke when I needed help might be because he was funneling everything into Nadia's trust. Was that why he called me for money so often? Because he'd locked away his own assets for his favored daughter? The thought churned my insides with a dangerous mix of sorrow and rage. Had it ended there, I might have gone on swallowing my anger as usual, but the events that followed would catapult me on a path of discovery, betrayal, and ultimately revenge. The moment I saw the official documents for myself, when I learned the full scope of my father's betrayal, was the moment I decided I was done. No more payments for his bills. No more attempts to earn his love. And perhaps most importantly, no more letting him and Nadia sail through life unscathed by their own deceits. After my father was discharged from the hospital, he had a pile of medical bills that needed settling bills. His insurance didn't fully cover. Though Nadia was the direct beneficiary of his future assets, she refused to pitch in. She'd laugh it off, saying she wasn't a financial wizard and that this was an adult's problem, not hers. My father, of course, came to me, asking for help. It was the same old song and dance. "I'm strapped for cash, can you help with the bills?" I'd grown used to hearing it, but this time something in me hardened. I thought of all my sacrifices, how I'd used my meager earnings to keep him afloat while my sister indulged in carefree living. My father had even mustered a subdued thank you once or twice, making me think I was doing the right thing by helping. But now I knew better. Now I understood the full depth of the betrayal. When he called me, I chose my words carefully, Dad. I don't think I can help you this time. I'm strapped myself. The silence on the other end was deafening. I could practically feel the air grow cold through the phone line. What do you mean you can't help? He demanded. You're a manager or something, right? You have that fancy college degree. You've always helped before. I closed my eyes, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. I'm sorry, I said, forcing every ounce of restraint I had into my voice. I just can't. He snapped something about ungrateful children, then hung up. It was the first time I stood my ground. My hands shook. A part of me felt liberated, but another part felt racked with guilt. This was my father, an old man who'd just gotten out of the hospital. But I refused to waver. Not this time. Not after realizing that every penny he ever had was earmarked for Nadia while he bled me dry out of convenience. Days passed, and my father refused to speak to me, apparently offended by my refusal to pay. Nadia, on the other hand, took to social media to post thinly veiled jabs about certain siblings who lacked familial loyalty. I'd see them pop up on my feed, snarky remarks about how a real daughter would help her father in his time of need, followed by squealing admiration from her circle of similarly entitled friends. It stung, but I was done playing the scapegoat. If she had a trust fund guaranteed by Dad, she could use some of that unearned windfall to pay his bills, right? Despite standing my ground, I was anxious and restless. I felt as though I was perched on the precipice of a greater confrontation. During one particularly sleepless night, I decided I needed proof, something to confirm my suspicions that my father had deliberately locked me out. I couldn't rely on Nadia's offhand comments alone. So I started digging. First, I recalled the name of a law firm Nadia had once casually mentioned when she bragged about Daddy's fancy lawyer. With no small amount of guilt, I pulled up their website and navigated to the Contact Us page. My intention was to see if they had any public records on file, or if there was some registry or notice that would confirm the trust's existence. But, of course, trust documents are private. There wouldn't be an obvious sign posted for me to see. I realized I'd have to be more resourceful. I considered forging my father's signature or impersonating him, but that felt morally wrong. As wrong as he and Nadia had treated me, I wasn't willing to stoop to blatant illegal activity. I took a different route. I contacted an old friend from high school who'd gone on to become a paralegal. We hadn't spoken in years, but I remembered she was kind-hearted. Over coffee, I explained the situation in vague terms, omitting personal details. I asked for her guidance. What could I do, legally, to see the details of a trust that might affect me as a direct relative? She sipped her latte thoughtfully and said, "Honestly, if your name's not on it, your father doesn't owe you disclosure. But sometimes, if there's reason to believe there's been some form of manipulation or wrongdoing, like if your father was using your finances, there may be a pathway to challenge it. However, you'd need evidence, bank statements, transfers, or something that shows a misuse of your money or credit." My mind reeled. For years, I'd been paying bills in my father's name, sometimes from my own accounts. I never bothered checking if he was actually paying me back, because I assumed his money was going toward living expenses. But what if he'd been siphoning it into this trust all along? If I could prove that, maybe I'd have leverage. That night, I opened my filing cabinet and started sorting through years of bank statements. Wire transfers, receipts, and random IOUs my father had jotted down on sticky notes. It was an overwhelming task. My father's finances were tangled, to say the least, but I noticed patterns. Sometimes I'd send him a sum for rent. Later, I'd see a deposit of the exact same amount into an account I didn't recognize. Another time I'd pay a hospital bill for him, and a few days later a matching amount would be withdrawn from his main checking, only to appear again in what looked like an investment account. I traced every penny I could until the early hours of the morning, coffee growing cold on the table. In that quiet darkness, the truth dawned on me like a blow to the gut. For years, I had essentially been funding Nadia's trust, whether directly or indirectly. My father had systematically taken my contributions and funneled them into that protected account. While I lived frugally, paying student loans, scraping by on modest paychecks, my father was carefully building a nest egg for Nadia, completely excluding me, his other daughter. My hands shook with rage. I felt tears burning my eyes, not of sadness but of pure, unadulterated fury. Every memory flashed before me. Me as a little girl, cleaning the house to gain his approval. Me as a teenager, begging him for help with a summer program and being denied. Me as a working college student, waiting tables until midnight. All that hardship, and he had turned around and used my sweat to give Nadia an even cushier life. In that moment, I knew I'd passed the point of no return. There would be no more illusions. No more attempts at being the good daughter. They had strung me along like a puppet while reaping the rewards of my labor. But a puppet no longer dances once its strings are cut, and I was about to tear them all down, one by one. Before I confronted either of them, I needed a plan, something that would ensure my father and Nadia couldn't simply dismiss me as they always did. Emotional outbursts alone wouldn't accomplish anything. I needed cold, hard evidence, something that would force them to take me seriously. With stacks of financial records and bank statements, I had a starting point. I spent the better part of a week carefully organizing the documents. I created a spreadsheet detailing every suspicious transfer, cross-referencing sums with the approximate dates. I'd sent him money. My paralegal friend helped me refine the timeline, pointing out which transactions were the most damning. By the end of that week, I had a small dossier that painted a crystal-clear picture. My father had been using me to pad Nadia's trust fund. And yet, a question gnawed at me. Was there any reason for him to do this beyond blatant favoritism? It seemed so deliberate, so malicious, to actively funnel my money into an account solely for Nadia's benefit. I wondered if there was a bigger scheme, or some piece of family history I was missing. As far as I knew, my mother had left no sizable inheritance, so it couldn't be that. But even if he had a reason like an archaic vow to set Nadia up for life, it didn't change the fact that I'd been lied to and robbed, in a sense. And it certainly didn't change my plan. Armed with my data, I called a family meeting. I chose a neutral location, a conference room at my paralegal friend's office, which we could use after hours. My father initially balked, complaining that he couldn't travel in his condition, but I insisted, hinting that it concerned his medical bills and a solution I'd found. Nadia, of course, only agreed when I mentioned it might impact the trust. If I had to guess, she was probably worried I was trying to stake a claim. When the day arrived, I got to the office early and set up. My father arrived first, limping slightly, but still emanating that same gruff sense of authority, as if nothing had changed. Nadia swept in next, all high heels and perfume, flipping her hair in a manner that suggested she considered this gathering a minor inconvenience. I watched as she surveyed the stark meeting room with a look of faint disgust, like the environment was beneath her. As soon as they were seated, my father asked, "So, what's this all about? I hope you're finally realizing you owe me some money for those medical bills." His tone dripped with condescension. Nadia smirked, crossing her legs and leaning back as though preparing for a spectacle. I took a deep breath. "Actually, Dad, I asked you both here to discuss something else, something important." I pulled out the manila folder I'd labeled meticulously and slid it toward them. This is a record of every wire transfer, check and bank transaction I've made to you over the past few years, specifically ones that ended up in Nadia's trust fund. Nadia's face changed instantly. Her smugness vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear. My father reached for the folder with a trembling hand. "What is this nonsense?" he barked. I didn't flinch. "It's not nonsense. It's documentation that you took money from me. Money I sent you under the impression it was for your living expenses, rent, or medical costs, and funneled it into a trust that only benefits Nadia." For a moment, silence reigned. My father opened and closed his mouth, like a fish starved of water. Nadia tried to laugh it off. "Oh, come on. You can't prove any of that was meant for the trust. Dad was just being financially savvy, right?" I slid another paper forward, highlighting specific dates and transaction IDs. "These transfers literally match the amounts I sent, down to the cent. On more than one occasion. It's not a coincidence." My father bristled. "So what if I used the money?" "I'm your father. You owe me some gratitude. I raised you, fed you, put clothes on your back." Anger flared in my chest. "You didn't pay for my college. You never helped me when I needed it. Every time I came home, you were broke, or so you said. Meanwhile, you've spent thousands on Nadia's education, lifestyle, and now her trust. Did it ever occur to you that I might deserve some consideration too? Or at least the truth?" Nadia rolled her eyes. "God, this is so dramatic. You're making it sound like we stole from you. Legally, Dad can do whatever he wants with money you give him." "That's correct," I said, "unless there's a pattern of financial abuse or misrepresentation. And from where I stand, that's exactly what happened. I was led to believe I was helping with his emergencies, hospital bills, rent, groceries, not padding your personal piggy bank." My father tried to speak, but his words came out in a low growl. He slapped the folder shut and glared at me with eyes that held years of pent-up resentment. "You think you're entitled to something? Well, guess what? Nadia is my youngest. She's always been my special girl. And you've always had that rebellious streak, that ungrateful tone. This is my right as a father." I felt a surge of numb clarity wash over me. "So you admit it?" I asked quietly. "You're telling me, to my face, that all these years you favored Nadia so blatantly that you would take my money and give it to her even as I struggled to make ends meet?" He smirked, and for a moment I saw in him a man who took pride in hurting me. "You took money from me in other ways, living under my roof for 18 years. You said it yourself. You wanted to help. Congratulations, you helped." I swallowed the lump in my throat. I had come here searching for an apology, or at least an admission of guilt. Instead, I got gloating. My father, it seemed, had no shame about his actions. Nadia looked equally undisturbed, a small smile dancing on her lips. I closed my eyes briefly, hearing my own heartbeat thunder. When I opened them, I forced a calmness into my voice. "Well, thank you for clarifying, because now we can skip right past the denial stage and move on to the consequences." I paused, savoring the uneasy silence. They exchanged glances clearly. They hadn't expected me to use that word. Consequences. "How dare you talk to me like that?" my father sneered. "You have no power here." "Actually," I said, "I do. And if you want to avoid me going public with this, showing your medical providers, your landlord, your acquaintances, or even a civil court exactly how you've been abusing my finances, then you'll listen carefully to what I have to say." Their faces blanched. In that moment, I knew I had them cornered. For once in my life, I held the cards. And seeing the fleeting look of fear in my father's eyes was more satisfying than any apology he could have given. My ultimatum was simple. Refund the money you took, or face legal action. Whether they sold assets or dissolved part of the trust didn't matter. If they wouldn't cooperate, I'd sue for misrepresentation and financial exploitation. Nadia bristled at losing her cushy future. "You're going to bankrupt, Dad," she sneered. "How could you be so cruel?" I had no sympathy left. "You used my money for years. If Dad has to downsize or you need to skip a luxurious trip, so be it." My father looked furious yet rattled, sweat beading on his forehead. He couldn't hide behind guilt trips or paternal authority anymore. For once, I held the power. We reached a stalemate. I gave them 30 days to return my funds. They stormed out, Nadia's heels striking the floor in a tense, angry rhythm. I felt a mix of fear and triumph. I'd always longed for a real bond with my father, but that dream was dead. If reclaiming what was stolen meant setting fire to old illusions, I was ready to watch them burn. 2 tense weeks passed with no sign of a genuine resolution. My father and Nadia ignored my ultimatum, hoping I'd cave under silence. But I was done being the obedient daughter they banked on. True to my word, I filed a civil complaint, claiming they had misrepresented their intentions and diverted my money into Nadia's trust. Local court records are public, and before I knew it, a journalist reached out to ask why a daughter would take legal action against her own family. At first, I hesitated to speak to the media. This was painful, deeply personal business. But then I remembered how my father had freely spread rumors about me for years, always painting me as ungrateful and disloyal. So I met with the journalist in a quiet coffee shop. I told her about the hidden fund, my years of supporting my father's emergencies, and my discovery that all of it benefited only Nadia. She took diligent notes, asking questions that made me relive the sting of betrayal. Still, I felt an odd relief as I voiced truths I'd been forced to swallow in silence. When the article appeared online, our community was stunned. Friends and neighbors who once believed my father's sob stories began to doubt him. Some even apologized to me for jumping to the wrong conclusions. Of course, others decided I was a monster for shaming my own father, but it no longer hurt. Their whispers couldn't compare to what I'd endured. Meanwhile, Nadia deactivated her social media, unable to handle the flood of comments criticizing her sense of entitlement. My father stopped showing his face at local hangouts. Rumor had it he was livid, calling me a liar to anyone who would still listen. For me, the article's impact was a fierce validation. I saw, at last, how quickly illusions can crumble when a little sunlight hits them. For so long, my father and sister had wielded power by controlling the story of who I was. But with the truth exposed, they could no longer hide behind manipulative half-truths. Despite the fear and uncertainty, I felt a flicker of hope that justice might finally be on my side. A court hearing was scheduled as part of the process. To my surprise, on the day of the hearing, my father showed up in a wheelchair. I didn't doubt he had legitimate health concerns, but I also suspected he might be playing them up to garner sympathy. Nadia hovered behind him, wearing a dark pantsuit and a sour expression. I was flanked by my paralegal friend, and though I was anxious, I felt an inner resolve. As we entered the small courtroom, I spotted the judge, a middle-aged woman, with an air of no-nonsense pragmatism. She reviewed the documents, listened to opening statements, and quickly grasped the core issue. Had my father and Nadia manipulated my funds under false pretenses, funneling them into an exclusive trust? My father's attorney tried to argue that any money given to him was a gift for which he had full discretion. Nadia's attorney hammered on the same point, that I had knowingly given money to my father, and therefore I had no claim to how it was used. But my side countered with evidence of multiple messages, phone calls, and emails where my father explicitly stated he needed money for rent, hospital bills, or specific living expenses. The trust documents showed the correlation in timing and amounts. The judge's expression remained neutral, but I could see her eyebrows raise at certain points. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, my heart pounding. "Your Honor," I began, "this is not about me trying to wrest an inheritance from my father. This is about deception, years of it. I gave him money out of good faith, believing it would be used for basic necessities. Instead, it was siphoned into a trust that not only excluded me, but actively funded my sister's lifestyle. Had my father been honest about his intentions, I would never have agreed to pay." The judge nodded, her gaze flicking from me to my father. "Mr. Ellis," she addressed him by his last name, "do you have a direct response to your daughter's claim?" My father cleared his throat, feigning frailty. I always wanted both my girls to be safe. My older daughter was always so independent. She never needed the help. Nadia was more delicate. I meant no harm. I clenched my teeth. This was the same warped logic Nadia had hinted at in the diner. The judge, however, seemed unimpressed. "You told your daughter you needed the money for hospital bills, correct?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, but I didn't realize that I couldn't deposit it elsewhere. I mean, I had bills from multiple accounts." The judge raised a hand to silence him. "We'll examine the actual statements." After reviewing more testimonies and documents, the judge didn't make an immediate ruling but advised both parties to consider mediation. Typically, this is where both sides could reach a settlement out of court. The judge also indicated that if it went to a final ruling, my father risked not only having to return the money, but possibly paying damages for misrepresentation. In the hallway afterward, my father looked more furious than frail. "You ungrateful brat!" he seethed, pointing an accusing finger, "dragging me through the mud like this. I never should have let you stay in my house after your mother died." I felt a cold, hollow sensation in my chest at his words. I locked eyes with Nadia, who looked away, her face flushed with shame or anger. I couldn't tell. Then, softly, I replied, "Well, you can't hurt me anymore, Dad. It's done." He started to say something else, but Nadia pulled him away, glancing at me with a mixture of hatred and something else, resentment, or maybe regret. In that moment, I felt a pang of sadness for all the potential love that had been squandered, but it was overshadowed by a fierce sense of self-preservation. I'd done everything I could to stand up for myself, to reclaim what was mine. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be a victim anymore. Mediation took place a week later in a private setting. We gathered around a long table, me and my legal support on one side, my father, Nadia, and their attorney on the other. The mediator, a calm older gentleman, tried his best to coax an agreement out of us. My father refused to look at me, focusing instead on the mediator. "I can't possibly pay everything she's asking for. I'll be bankrupt. Look at my medical bills. I need that money to survive." I felt my anger flare. "You survived just fine when you were funneling my money away for Nadia. You weren't worried about medical bills then," Nadia huffed. "I'm not giving up my entire trust just because you have a grudge." The mediator held up a hand. "Let's remain courteous. Now, can we find a middle ground?" I sighed, glancing at my notes. "I'm open to a payment plan," I offered, "spread out over a few years. But the principal amount needs to be accounted for, plus a reasonable interest for the time it was held." My father's eyes lit with indignation, while Nadia shot me a venomous glare. "Interest?" she echoed, her voice dripping with disbelief. I raised my chin. "You're basically returning a loan you never acknowledged was a loan in the first place." "I'm well within my rights to request interest." Their attorney interjected, trying to negotiate a lower sum. We spent hours going back and forth, tensions running high. Eventually, the mediator asked for a private caucus, speaking separately with each side. When he met with me, I explained that this lawsuit wasn't just about money, It was about principle. But of course, money was the only lever I had left to assert that principle. After much wrangling, a settlement was drafted. It wasn't the full amount I believed they owed me, but it was a substantial sum enough to wipe out my own debts and give me a solid start toward a new life. The payment would be split between a lump sum taken directly from Nadia's trust. Yes, they'd have to dissolve part of it, and a monthly payment that my father would handle. If they defaulted, the case would immediately proceed to final judgment, and I'd be entitled to collect everything I'd asked for originally. I stared at the settlement papers, my pen hovering over the signature line. This was it, the moment I'd fought so hard for. I glanced up at Nadia. She looked pale, her eyes fixed on the table, perhaps coming to grips with the reality that a chunk of her guaranteed future was gone. My father sat stiffly in his wheelchair, face drawn. We locked eyes briefly, and I saw something flicker. There may be regret, or maybe just defeat. In that charged silence, I realized I felt more pity for them than triumph. They had destroyed any chance of real family unity for the sake of an entitled, lopsided plan. Now they were paying the price. My father averted his gaze, and Nadia fiddled with her expensive watch, refusing to look at me. I signed the papers. The mediator nodded, and our attorneys co-signed. Just like that, it was done. Years of deceit, favoritism, and quiet suffering came to a head in a settlement agreement. It might not have been the cinematic justice I had once fantasized, about no grand speech or televised takedown, but it was real, tangible accountability. And more than enough for me to finally cut them both out of my life. In the months that followed, I started receiving those settlement payments. The first lump sum was enough to pay off my student loans, credit card debt, and still have a healthy chunk to put aside for a rainy day. I moved into a better apartment, one with large windows and bright sunlight that reminded me of the hope I'd clung to in childhood. Each time a payment arrived, I felt a small wave of satisfaction, not just at the monetary compensation, but at the symbolic victory it represented. Meanwhile, life for my father and Nadia changed drastically. Without full access to the trust's previous wealth, Nadia had to sell her downtown loft and move into a more modest place. Gossip circulated that she was forced to find an actual job, something in retail. I heard. My father, too, had to face the reality that his golden goose had flown the coop. There were rumors he was downsizing to a small condo with limited accessibility, relying on public assistance to handle his medical needs. Part of me felt pangs of sympathy for him, but then I remembered his smug face during that final confrontation. He had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. Surprisingly, a few relatives and friends who had once ostracized me came around with apologies. They said they hadn't known the full extent of the situation, that they believed my father's stories. Some offered hollow excuses like, "We thought maybe you just didn't want to help him." I nodded politely, but I never again opened my heart fully to these people. Trust, once broken, is hard to mend. Despite the heaviness of it all, there was also a sense of lightness in my life now. I no longer carried the guilt of being my family's sole provider, of picking up my father's bills while Nadia reaped the rewards. I no longer felt overshadowed by their manipulative tactics. For the first time, I was free to focus on my own future, unburdened by the ghosts of unrequited family loyalty. I decided to invest part of my settlement into starting a small business, a modest online platform for home goods and lifestyle products, ironically inspired by the knowledge I'd gained in college and at the startup where I worked. As I poured my creativity into building it, I realized something beautiful. I wasn't just fighting against the injustice of my past. I was building a future that belonged solely to me. Every success, every new customer, every small profit was a testament to my resilience. And I found real support, too. My paralegal friend, who had been by my side throughout this ordeal, introduced me to other women who had dealt with familial manipulation and financial abuse. We formed a small group, meeting monthly to share our stories, tears, and triumphs. In them, I found a sisterhood that was far more genuine than anything I'd had with Nadia. These were women who knew the sting of betrayal and the sweetness of vindication. In the end, my story wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming my power, about standing up against the people who hurt me. Even if they were the ones I once called family, I was done carrying the burdens they shoved on my shoulders. I found that, in shedding them, I discovered a depth of inner strength I never knew I possessed. And that is the real victory, not the settlement checks or the business success, though those are nice perks. The real victory was learning that I could be both kind and fierce, loving and formidable. I could grieve the family I'd never truly had, while forging a life that was authentically mine. No longer the girl in the shadows, no longer the scapegoat daughter. I walked away from that chapter with my head held high, leaving behind the broken fragments of a one-sided trust and stepping into the bright, open world where I finally felt at home. Thank you for joining me on this roller coaster of emotions, betrayal, and ultimately, triumph. If this story resonated with you, if you felt the sting of injustice or the fiery spark of hope, please remember that reclaiming your power starts with one step, one decision to stand up for yourself, no matter how scary it seems. My journey taught me that we can't always choose our family, but we can choose how we respond to their actions. If you found value or inspiration in this story, I'd love your support in helping me share it. Please click the like button, share this video with someone who might need a reminder of their inner strength, and subscribe to this channel for more stories of courage, resilience, and empowerment. Your engagement helps build a community where we uplift each other and learn that sometimes the most healing act of love is standing up for ourselves.